Not long ago, I woke up in a hospital bed and realized two things at the same time. First, I was incredibly lucky to still be alive. And second, the reason I had almost died wasn't an accident, a medical mistake, or bad luck. It was my stepson. Someone in my own home had been quietly replacing my life-saving medication with fake pills for weeks, long enough for my body to begin shutting down, long enough for me to collapse alone on the living room floor, barely able to breathe, long enough for doctors to later tell me that if help had arrived even a little later, I probably wouldn't be here telling this story. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that morning I believed the worst thing my illness could do was weaken my body. I had no idea it was about to expose the most dangerous person in my family. When the truth finally came out, it didn't just destroy my health, it destroyed my marriage, my family, and everything I thought I understood about trust. But what happened after that? The revenge, the fallout, and the moment when everything finally collapsed in front of an entire room of people, that's a story I never expected my life to become. Before we get into it, if you enjoy real-life stories about betrayal, justice, and the complicated things families do to each other, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this are difficult to tell, but they remind us how fragile trust can really be. Now, to understand how everything unraveled, you have to start with the life I thought I was living. As I mentioned earlier, I'm 46 years old, and until recently, I lived in Denver, Colorado, with my wife Melissa and her son from a previous marriage. Melissa is 43. We had been married for 5 years. She worked as a real estate agent, the kind of person who could talk comfortably with anyone, anywhere. Friendly, organized, and always busy. When we met, she had already been divorced for several years and was raising her son on her own. Her son's name is Tyler Grant. Tyler was 17, a senior at Cherry Creek High School. Smart, confident, and sometimes a little too sure of himself in the way teenagers can be. I came into his life when he was around 13. At first, things between us were normal enough. Not exactly warm, but not hostile either. I never expected him to suddenly see me as a replacement father. I understood that role was complicated. My goal was simpler than that. I just wanted our home to feel stable. For a while it did. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in Highlands Ranch just outside Denver, a comfortable house, nothing extravagant, but big enough that everyone had their own space. My job as a senior IT systems analyst kept me busy during the week, mostly designing and maintaining software systems for healthcare networks. It was stable work, analytical, predictable. The kind of job where problems could usually be solved with enough patience. Life, I thought, worked the same way. What complicated things was my health. I have Addison's disease. It's not a condition many people have heard of, and honestly, before I was diagnosed, I hadn't either. The simplest way to explain it is this: my body can't produce enough of a hormone called cortisol, which the body needs to regulate blood pressure, energy, and stress. Without that hormone, the body slowly begins to shut down. Thankfully, there's a straightforward treatment, a daily medication that replaces what my body can't produce on its own. As long as I take it consistently, my life is almost completely normal. Miss it long enough, though, and things become dangerous, very dangerous. Because of that, I'm careful. I take my medication every day, without fail. I wear a medical alert bracelet. My doctors monitor my levels regularly. It's simply part of my routine now, like brushing my teeth or checking the weather before leaving the house. Melissa knew about my condition before we married. Tyler did too. It was never a secret, but over time, I started noticing something about the way Tyler reacted to it. He didn't believe it. Not exactly outright at first. It was more subtle than that. If I mentioned feeling tired after a long day, he'd roll his eyes. If I needed to sit down or rest, he'd make little comments under his breath, the kind of sarcastic remarks teenagers sometimes make when they think adults are exaggerating something. Once, when I excused myself from helping move furniture because I was feeling dizzy, he muttered, "Guess the miracle medicine isn't working today." Melissa scolded him for that, told him he was being disrespectful. He shrugged it off like it was nothing. I tried to do the same. Teenagers push boundaries. They test people. I remembered being 17 once, myself convinced I understood the world better than most adults around me. It didn't seem worth turning every sarcastic comment into an argument. Still, the attitude lingered, and one evening I overheard him talking to a friend on the phone in his room. He didn't realize I was walking down the hallway when I heard my name. He was laughing, saying he thought I was probably just a hypochondriac, that the pills I took were probably placebo tablets or vitamins, and that the whole illness thing was just a way to get attention. I stood there for a moment outside his door, listening. Part of me felt angry. Another part felt strangely sad. In the end, I chose the same response I always did. I let it go. I assumed it was immaturity, ignorance, something he would grow out of as he got older and learned a little more about how complicated the real world can be. What I didn't realize then was that Tyler wasn't just skeptical. He was curious, and that curiosity, as it turned out, was about to become the most dangerous thing in my life. Looking back, now, the first signs that something was wrong didn't arrive all at once. They crept in quietly. At first it was just fatigue, not the normal kind that comes after a long day at work, but the kind that sits deeper in your bones, the kind that makes even simple things feel heavier than they should. I remember one afternoon sitting at my desk, staring at a line of code that I'd written dozens of times before, and for some reason my brain just stalled. It was strange. I'd been managing Addison's disease for years by then. Once the right medication routine was established, my life had settled into a predictable rhythm. As long as I took my hydrocortisone tablets every day, my energy stayed stable and my body functioned normally. That routine had worked perfectly for a long time. So when the fatigue started creeping back in, I assumed it was stress. Work had been busy. Melissa was juggling several demanding real estate clients. Tyler was finishing his senior year at Cherry Creek High School, which meant college applications, deadlines, and the constant tension that comes with teenagers preparing to leave home. Life was noisy. Feeling tired didn't seem like a mystery worth investigating. But then, the dizziness began. One morning I stood up from the kitchen table and had to grab the counter to steady myself. The room tilted slightly, the way it does when you stand up too fast. I waited a few seconds for the feeling to pass, except it didn't pass as quickly as it should have. Melissa noticed. "You okay?" she asked, watching me carefully, from the other side of the kitchen island. "Yeah," I said, waving it off. "Just stood up too fast." She studied me for a moment longer before returning to the email she'd been typing on her phone. It was a small moment, one of dozens that would follow over the next several weeks, because the symptoms didn't stop there. The dizziness came back the next day. Then again, a few days later. My muscles started aching more than usual, especially in the mornings. I felt drained, even after a full night's sleep. Still, I kept taking my medication exactly the way I always had. Every morning, every evening, no missed doses. The routine was automatic at this point. I'd wake up, head to the kitchen, open the cabinet near the coffee maker, where I kept the bottle, and swallow the tablets with a glass of water while the coffee brewed. Simple. Reliable. Or at least, that's what I believed. As the weeks went on, though, the symptoms became harder to ignore. One afternoon at work, I felt a wave of nausea so sudden that I had to leave a meeting halfway through and sit down in the hallway outside the conference room. My coworker, Mark, followed me out a minute later. "You look pale, man," he said. "I'm fine," I replied automatically. He didn't look convinced. "You sure you're not coming down with something I've got, Addison's?" I reminded him. "Sometimes my energy just dips." That explanation usually ended the conversation. Most people didn't know much about the disease, and I preferred it that way. I didn't like making my health the center of attention. But even as I reassured him, a quiet worry had begun forming in the back of my mind. Because Addison's symptoms returning like this usually meant one of two things. Either the disease was progressing, or the medication wasn't working properly. Neither possibility felt particularly comforting. So I scheduled a checkup, with my endocrinologist. A few days later, I was sitting in a small exam room at UC Health University of Colorado Hospital while Dr. Olivia Ramirez reviewed my blood work on a tablet. She frowned slightly. "Your cortisol levels are lower than I expected," she said. "It's not good, right?" I asked. "It's unusual," she replied carefully, "especially since you've been stable for several years." "I take the medication every day," I said immediately. "I believe you," she said. And I believed her. When she said that, Dr. Ramirez had been treating me long enough that trust between us went both ways. She leaned back slightly in her chair thinking. "Sometimes pharmacies receive batches that are slightly less effective than expected," she explained. "It's rare, but it happens, so the medication might be weak, possibly, or your body might simply need a slightly higher dose now." Neither explanation sounded particularly dramatic. Medical problems often had boring answers. Still, she adjusted my prescription slightly and told me to monitor my symptoms closely over the next few weeks. "If things don't improve, we'll investigate further," she said. I left the appointment feeling cautiously reassured. Problems had solutions. That's what I told myself. But when I got home that evening and stepped into the kitchen, Tyler was sitting at the counter scrolling through his phone. He glanced up briefly. "You look like crap," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Thanks. I'm serious," he continued casually. "You look worse than usual. Just a long day." He shrugged and went back to his phone. It should have been an ordinary conversation, but there was something about the way he said it that lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Not concern, not curiosity, something closer to observation, like someone watching an experiment unfold. At the time, I dismissed the thought almost immediately. I had no reason to think anything else, but over the next couple of weeks, my health continued sliding in the wrong direction. The fatigue deepened. The dizziness became more frequent. Some mornings, it took all my effort just to get dressed and drive to work. And every single day, without fail, I kept taking the medication that was supposed to keep my body functioning normally, which meant there was only one conclusion left. Something wasn't working. What I didn't know yet was that the real problem wasn't inside my body at all. It was already sitting quietly inside my own house, and soon my life was moving closer to the edge than I had ever imagined. Over the next several days, my condition kept sliding in the wrong direction. At first, I tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Humans are surprisingly good at ignoring problems when the alternative is frightening. I told myself the dosage adjustment Dr. Ramirez had prescribed just needed time to work. But my body seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. The fatigue deepened into something heavier. It wasn't just feeling tired anymore. It was a kind of draining weakness that settled into every muscle. Walking up the stairs in our house left me breathing harder than it should have. Some mornings, just standing in the shower felt like an effort. If you've ever pushed through something like this, pretending everything was fine, while your body was clearly telling you otherwise, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Do you think I should have trusted my instincts sooner? Let me know in the comments. Melissa noticed. "You're not getting better," she said one evening as we sat in the living room. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. "I will," I said, trying to sound confident. The doctor adjusted the medication. She studied me quietly. "You sure you're taking it exactly the way you're supposed to?" I nodded. Every day, and that was true, every single day. The pills were still part of my morning routine. Same cabinet, same bottle, same small white tablets I swallowed with water while the coffee machine hummed behind me. There was no reason they shouldn't have been working. Tyler, meanwhile, seemed oddly attentive to my condition, not concerned, just observant. If I sat down during dinner, because I felt dizzy, I'd sometimes notice him watching me from across the table. If I excused myself early because of exhaustion, his eyes followed me as I left the room. Once, as I leaned against the kitchen counter trying to steady myself, he gave a small, almost amused smile. "Still feeling sick?" he asked casually. "Yeah, I replied. Huh. That was it. Just that one word. But the tone stayed with me longer than I expected. At the time, though, I was too focused on simply getting through each day to analyze a teenager's attitude. And then came the afternoon. Everything finally collapsed. It was a Saturday. Melissa had left earlier that day to show a house to some clients across town. Tyler had mentioned he was going to spend the afternoon at a friend's place. The house was quiet. I remember sitting on the couch scrolling through emails on my laptop when the first wave of nausea hit. It came fast, a sharp twist in my stomach that made me lean forward slightly, waiting for the sensation to pass. Except it didn't pass. Within minutes, the dizziness followed. The room seemed to tilt sideways. My heart started pounding harder, and a cold sweat spread across the back of my neck. I knew that feeling. Every patient with Addison's disease is warned about it. Adrenal crisis. It happens when the body doesn't have enough cortisol to function properly. Blood pressure drops, organs begin struggling to maintain basic balance. Without treatment, the situation can become life-threatening very quickly. And suddenly, I understood what was happening. My medication hadn't been working. And now, my body was running out of time. I tried to stand. The moment I pushed myself off the couch, my legs buckled slightly beneath me. I grabbed the edge of the coffee table to steady myself, breathing slowly through the dizziness. Think. Call for help. The nearest hospital was only about 15 minutes away, but in that moment, even walking across the room felt impossible. Then I remembered my brother. Nathan Carter lived about 10 minutes away. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Ethan. Nate. My voice sounded strange, even to me, slurred and weak. Something's wrong. Mest, what's going on, I think? I think I'm going into adrenal crisis. There was a brief pause. Then his tone changed instantly. I'm coming over, right now. Hurry, I managed to say. The phone slipped from my hand a second later. I remember trying to stay conscious, trying to focus on something, anything in the room. The pattern of the rug, the light coming through the window. But my vision was already fading. The last thing I recall clearly was the sound of the front door being forced open. Nathan later told me what happened next. When I didn't respond to his calls after our phone conversation ended, he drove straight over. When he arrived and saw me lying motionless on the living room floor through the front window, he didn't hesitate. He broke the door open. By the time he reached me, I was unconscious. He immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes. My blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and my body was already beginning to shut down. They administered emergency steroids on the spot before rushing me into the ambulance. Nathan rode with them to the hospital. I have no memory of the ride. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed hours later. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and disinfectant. A soft, electronic monitor beeped steadily somewhere beside me. My head felt heavy, like I'd been pulled out of a deep sleep. When my eyes focused, I saw two familiar faces sitting nearby, Melissa and Nathan. Melissa's eyes were red from crying. Nathan looked exhausted. You're awake, Melissa whispered, leaning forward. What happened? I asked weakly. You had an adrenal crisis, Nathan said quietly. The words hung in the air for a moment. You nearly died, Melissa added. I closed my eyes again briefly, trying to process that. Nearly died. Dr. Ramirez entered the room not long afterward. She explained what the medical team had already confirmed. My cortisol levels had crashed. Without the emergency steroids the paramedics administered, my organs would have continued shutting down. You were extremely lucky, she said. Lucky. The word didn't feel quite right, because one question kept echoing in my mind. How could this have happened if I'd been taking my medication every single day? The answer, as it turned out, was about to change everything I thought I understood about my own home, and about the person who had been living under the same roof as me all along. For the first few hours after I woke up, the hospital room felt strangely quiet. Machines beeped softly beside my bed. Nurses moved in and out, checking monitors, adjusting IV lines, asking simple questions about how I felt. Physically, the worst of the crisis had already passed. The emergency steroids the paramedics administered had stabilized my system, and additional medication was slowly bringing my cortisol levels back to something resembling normal. But none of that answered the one question that kept circling in my mind. How had this happened? I had taken my medication every day. I was certain of it. Later that evening, Dr. Olivia Ramirez returned to the room carrying the small prescription bottle Melissa had brought from our house. She set it on the bedside table and looked at me thoughtfully. "We're trying to understand what caused the crisis," she said. "You're absolutely sure you've been taking your hydrocortisone regularly?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Every morning?" Melissa nodded beside me. "I've seen him take it, so it's part of his routine." Dr. Ramirez picked up the bottle. We ran some tests on the tablets. Something in her voice made the room feel colder. And I asked. She hesitated briefly before answering. "The pills inside this bottle aren't hydrocortisone." For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They look identical to your prescription tablets," she continued, "but chemically they contain no active medication." My chest tightened. "So, what are they most likely? Some kind of placebo or over-the-counter tablet?" Melissa stared at the bottle, like it had suddenly become something dangerous. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "It's extremely unusual," Dr. Ramirez replied carefully, "but we confirmed it with the hospital pharmacy." My mind raced. If the pills weren't real medication, that meant one thing. I hadn't been treating my Addison's disease at all. Every dose I thought I'd taken had done absolutely nothing, and that meant someone had changed them. The first assumption everyone made was that the pharmacy must have made a mistake. It sounded terrifying, but also logical. Prescription errors, while rare, do happen. The hospital contacted the Walgreens pharmacy on Colfax Avenue, where I normally filled my prescriptions. They checked the lot numbers, the shipment records, and the medication batches. Everything matched perfectly. The pharmacy had dispensed the correct medication, which meant the pills had been replaced after they arrived in our home. Dr. Ramirez looked at both of us carefully. "Has anyone else had access to this bottle?" she asked. Melissa and I exchanged a glance. There were only 3 people living in the house, and both of us knew exactly who the third person was. Tyler. Neither of us said his name out loud at first, but the realization was already settling in. Melissa's face turned pale. "He wouldn't—" She began softly, though the sentence never finished. The hospital staff didn't waste time speculating. Tampering with life-saving medication isn't just dangerous, it's a serious criminal offense. Within an hour, hospital administrators had contacted local authorities to report the situation as a possible poisoning case. Not long after that, a police officer arrived to take my statement. His name was Detective Aaron Mills. He spoke calmly, asking careful questions about my medication routine, who had access to the house, and whether anyone might have had reason to interfere with my prescriptions. I answered everything honestly. When he asked about Tyler, I hesitated. "He's 17, I said quietly. "Melissa's son. Does he have access to your medication?" "Yes. Has he ever expressed doubts about your illness?" That question made something twist in my stomach. "Yes," I admitted. Detective Mills nodded slightly, making notes on a small tablet. "We'll need to speak with him," he said. By that evening, officers had already gone to our house. Melissa stayed at the hospital with me while the police spoke to Tyler. Hours later, my brother Nathan received a phone call from the detective and stepped out into the hallway to take it. When he returned, his expression had changed. "What happened?" I asked. Nathan looked at Melissa before answering. At first, he denied everything he said quietly. Melissa closed her eyes, but when they explained the evidence, Nathan continued, he stopped denying it. My heart felt like it dropped through the floor. "What do you mean?" Nathan exhaled, slowly. He admitted it. The room went silent. "He told them he'd been replacing your pills for weeks," Nathan said. Melissa covered her mouth with both hands. I stared at the ceiling, trying to understand the words. "Replacing my pills. Weeks." "Why?" I asked finally. Nathan looked almost as stunned as I felt. Because he wanted to see if your illness was real. The explanation sounded so absurd that it barely registered. According to the detective, Tyler had bought generic white tablets online. Over time, he swapped out small amounts of the real pills with the fake ones, so I wouldn't notice a sudden change in the bottle. His logic was simple. If I really needed the medication, I would get sick. If I didn't, then my illness must have been fake. It was an experiment, and that experiment had nearly killed me. The police later recovered the hidden bottle containing my real medication from Tyler's bedroom. When I heard that something inside me broke, this wasn't a prank. It wasn't a moment of teenage stupidity. It was weeks of watching me grow weaker, knowing exactly why it was happening and saying nothing, even when I collapsed, even when I was in the ICU. Tyler Grant had stood by silently while my body shut down, and the consequences of that choice were only just beginning to unfold. In the days after Tyler's confession, the house on Highlands Ranch no longer felt like a home. It felt like the scene of a crime. I remained in the hospital for several more days while doctors stabilized my cortisol levels and slowly transitioned me back onto the proper hydrocortisone medication. Physically, my body began recovering faster than anyone expected. Once the correct treatment was back in place, the worst symptoms faded. But the emotional shock was something else entirely. Melissa spent most of that time sitting beside my hospital bed. She apologized over and over again, even though I knew none of this had been her doing. "I don't understand how he could do something like this," she said one night, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer for her, because I didn't understand it either. Tyler wasn't allowed to come to the hospital. After his confession, the police had taken him in for questioning. Since he was still 17 at the time, the case moved through the juvenile system, which meant the process was quieter and slower than an adult criminal investigation. Still, the evidence was undeniable. The hidden bottle of my real medication had been found in his room. The fake tablets he had purchased online were recovered as well. And according to the detective, Tyler admitted exactly what he had done. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion, just a deliberate decision that had nearly cost me my life. A few weeks later, once I had been discharged from the hospital, the legal process finally reached its conclusion. Tyler was formally charged with felony medication tampering in juvenile court. I attended the hearing. Walking into that courtroom was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Tyler sat at a table beside his attorney, looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched slightly as if he were trying to disappear. Melissa sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. The police report, the hospital records, the testimony explaining how replacing life-saving medication could have led to death. When Tyler was asked if he understood the charges, he nodded silently, and then the decision came. Because he was a minor, the court chose rehabilitation over punishment. Tyler was declared delinquent on the charge, which meant the court recognized the seriousness of the crime. But instead of detention, the judge ordered probation, mandatory counseling, and community service. That was it. No jail, no long-term consequences beyond a juvenile record. As the courtroom emptied, I sat there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. The boy who had nearly killed me walked out of the room with nothing more than supervised probation. Melissa looked relieved. "He's still a kid," she whispered softly. A kid. The word echoed in my mind. A kid who had secretly replaced life-saving medication for weeks. A kid who had watched me grow weaker and weaker without saying a word. A kid who had waited until police confronted him before finally admitting what he'd done. When we got back to the house, later that evening, the silence between Melissa and me felt heavier than ever. Tyler had already moved temporarily to his father's place while the situation settled down. The house felt emptier without him there. But it didn't feel peaceful. I kept replaying the events in my mind, the weeks of unexplained symptoms, the dizziness. The moment I collapsed on the living room floor, the doctors had been very clear about something. If Nathan hadn't arrived when he did, I likely wouldn't have survived. And yet, the person responsible was now back home with his other parent, continuing his life with only minor consequences. Something about that realization began to harden inside me. I wasn't someone who believed in revenge. At least I hadn't been before this happened. I had always believed problems should be solved calmly, rationally, but this situation didn't feel calm or rational. It felt unfinished. The legal system had delivered its answer, but that answer didn't feel like justice. Over the next few days, a quiet idea began forming in the back of my mind. Not something reckless, not something violent, just consequences that the courtroom had failed to deliver. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Tyler's experiment shouldn't simply fade into the background of everyone's memory. Because what he had done wasn't just dangerous, it was malicious, and actions like that should leave a mark. Maybe I was wrong to feel that way. Maybe anger was clouding my judgment. But if you were in my position, if someone had nearly killed you and then walked away with a warning, tell me honestly, would you have just let it go? Over the next few weeks, the anger I felt didn't disappear. It changed. At first, it was raw, the kind of emotion that keeps you awake at night, replaying the same moment over and over again. The living room floor, the dizziness, the realization that someone inside my own home had been quietly watching me deteriorate. But as time passed, that anger slowly became something colder, more focused. I kept thinking about the way Tyler had described his actions to the police. According to Detective Mills, he had framed it like some twisted science project. If the illness was real, I would get sick. If it wasn't, then I must have been exaggerating. An experiment. And the more I thought about that word, the more it bothered me, because experiments are supposed to have consequences, and the court had delivered almost none. So I began thinking about what consequences might actually look like. The first step wasn't something I'm particularly proud of. One Saturday afternoon, when I knew Melissa and Tyler were both out of the house visiting relatives, I walked upstairs to Tyler's room. I didn't break anything. I didn't damage anything. I simply took his laptop, a sleek Apple MacBook Pro he'd saved up months to buy. It sat on his desk, exactly where he'd left it. I powered it down, slipped it into a backpack, and carried it downstairs. Then I staged something that looked like a small burglary. I opened the window latch in his room, scattered a few items around the desk, and left the space looking like someone had entered quickly and taken the most obvious piece of electronics before leaving. When Melissa and Tyler returned home later that evening, Tyler was the first one upstairs. "Mom," he shouted a moment later. We ran up the stairs together. "My laptop's gone," he said, staring at the empty desk. Melissa immediately looked toward the open window. "Did someone break in?" That's exactly what it looked like. The police took a report later that night. A minor burglary, they said, probably someone checking for unlocked windows and grabbing whatever they could carry quickly. Tyler was furious. He spent the next few days complaining about everything he had stored on that computer, school projects, applications, personal files. I said, very little. Because by then, I already had the laptop hidden safely in my own office closet. That was only the beginning. Tyler was 17, a senior at Cherry Creek High School, just a few months away from graduation. The University of Arizona had offered him admission earlier that spring. Melissa had been thrilled when the letter arrived. Tyler had talked about it constantly moving away, starting a new chapter, leaving high school behind. A fresh start. But I kept thinking about something. Universities take student conduct very seriously, especially when it involves violent or dangerous behavior. So I gathered some documents. As the victim in the case, I had access to the police report and my hospital records, the paperwork describing exactly how Tyler's actions had caused a medical emergency. I copied everything, and then I wrote a short letter. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just a straightforward explanation that the student they had admitted had recently been involved in a serious incident involving the tampering of life-saving medication. I mailed the packet anonymously to the university's admissions office. I didn't expect to hear anything back, but apparently someone there took the information seriously enough to look into it. 2 weeks later, Tyler received another letter. This one wasn't an acceptance. It informed him that his admission had been rescinded after the university reviewed new information regarding a serious incident. I remember the moment he opened it at the kitchen table. What he said confused at first, and then he read the rest. His face went pale. They took it back. Melissa grabbed the letter from his hands, reading it quickly. They can't do that, she said. But they could. Tyler spent the next several days trying to appeal the decision. Emails, phone calls, messages through the admissions portal. Nothing changed. The university didn't explain further. They simply closed the door. Melissa eventually suspected where the information might have come from, though she never directly accused me. One evening, she looked at me across the living room. They mentioned the police report, she said, quietly. I shrugged. That's public record. She didn't reply, but I could see the tension building between us. The third step happened shortly after that. My medical bills from the hospital were enormous. Even with insurance through Blue Cross Blue Shield Colorado, the ICU, stay alone, had left me responsible for a significant amount of money. Legally, Tyler was a minor, which meant I couldn't sue him directly, but I could sue his father. Daniel Grant owned a construction company in Denver, Grant Ridge Construction, and had always done well financially. More importantly, he had shared Tyler's skepticism about my illness long before any of this happened, so I filed a civil lawsuit against him. The claim was simple. His son's actions had caused severe medical harm, and I intended to recover the costs. When Daniel received the legal notice, his reaction was immediate. According to Melissa, he called Tyler and yelled for nearly 20 minutes straight. For the first time since everything had started, someone in that family seemed to understand how serious the situation really was, but I still wasn't finished. By the time the lawsuit against Daniel Grant was filed, the atmosphere inside our house had changed completely. Melissa and I still spoke, but the warmth that had once defined our marriage was gone. Every conversation felt cautious, like two people trying to walk across thin ice without causing cracks. She knew something had shifted in me. And the truth was, she was right. The anger I carried had become quieter, more controlled, but it hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened my sense that what Tyler had done shouldn't simply fade away as a teenage mistake. There was still one more piece of the story that needed to come to light, and I knew exactly where to find it. Remember the laptop Tyler thought had been stolen? A few nights after the supposed burglary, I powered it on in the privacy of my home office. Tyler had never been particularly careful with security. His login password was something simple I had seen him type before. Within minutes, I was looking at his files. Most of what I found was ordinary teenage clutter school assignments, gaming folders, music downloads. But buried inside one directory was a folder labeled Clips. Curiosity got the better of me. When I opened it, I immediately understood what it contained. Videos, several short recordings of Tyler and one of his friends joking around with a phone camera. At first, the clips seemed harmless teenage humor, stupid dares, loud laughter. Then I opened the third file. The camera pointed at Tyler, standing dramatically in the middle of his bedroom. In the video, he clutched an empty pill bottle and staggered around the room, pretending to faint. "Look at me," he said in a mocking voice. "I have my mysterious illness." His friend laughed loudly behind the camera. Tyler continued the act, pretending to swallow pills and collapse onto his bed. Stepdad forgot his miracle medicine again. He joked. The laughter that followed felt like a punch to the stomach. There were several more videos like that. Different jokes, different variations of the same theme. Mocking people with chronic illnesses, mocking me specifically. Watching them, something inside me went cold. I copied the files. Then I copied 2 of the worst clips and sent them to a local parent group that had been asking questions about the incident. The caption was simple. "This is what a high school senior from our town thinks of people with chronic illnesses. The same student who recently admitted to tampering with his stepfather's medication." The response was immediate. Within hours, the videos began spreading through local online groups. Parents recognized Tyler from school events. Some of his classmates shared the clips privately among themselves. By the next morning, the situation had exploded. Tyler's reputation at Cherry Creek High School collapsed almost overnight. Teachers heard about it. Parents heard about it. Even a few of Melissa's real estate clients mentioned seeing the posts online. For the first time since the crisis began, Tyler experienced the kind of public scrutiny his actions deserved. He barely left his room for days, but the final confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. 2 months after the hospital incident, Melissa's parents held a dinner at the Capitol Grill in Denver to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. Despite everything that had happened, I was still invited. Melissa and I were living in a strange, in-between state. At that point, neither fully reconciled nor completely separated. Tyler was there too, sitting quietly at the table across from me. Most of Melissa's extended family had only heard a vague explanation about my hospitalization. Melissa had tried to protect her son from deeper questions. That protection ended that night. Halfway through dinner, as relatives raised glasses to celebrate the anniversary, the conversation slowly drifted toward recent events. Melissa's father looked across the table at me. "We heard you were in the hospital a couple months ago," he said. "Melissa told us it was some kind of medical emergency. What exactly happened?" Melissa shifted uncomfortably beside me. "It's already been handled," she said quickly. "There's no reason to go into it tonight." Her father frowned. "If someone in this family nearly died, I think we deserve to understand why." The table grew quiet. Melissa turned to me, her voice tight. "Ethan, maybe we should talk about this another time." For a moment I considered letting it go. This dinner wasn't meant to become a battlefield, but the silence around the table made it clear that everyone was already wondering the same thing. I was hospitalized because my life-saving medication had been replaced with fake pills, I said calmly. Several people looked confused. Melissa's father leaned forward. "Replaced by who?" Across the table, Tyler had gone completely still. After a moment, I answered. "By Tyler." The reaction was immediate. Melissa's mother gasped softly. Her father leaned forward in disbelief. Conversations around the table stopped completely. Tyler sat frozen in his chair. Melissa turned toward me sharply. "Ethan," she said under her breath. But I kept speaking. "I collapsed in my living room because of it," I continued. "Doctors later told me that if help had arrived any later, I likely wouldn't have survived." Melissa's father suddenly pushed his chair back. "Is this true?" he demanded, looking directly at Tyler. Tyler didn't answer. His face had gone pale. The silence around the table felt unbearable. Melissa stood up quickly. "How could you say this?" "Here?" she asked, her voice rising. "Because everyone deserves to know what happened," I replied calmly. The argument exploded from there. Voices rose. Chairs scraped across the floor. Some relatives tried to calm Melissa's father, who was now furious. Others stared at Tyler with expressions ranging from shock to anger. Within minutes, the celebration had completely collapsed. Tyler rushed out of the restaurant, humiliated. Melissa followed him. I stayed behind long enough to apologize quietly to her parents. "I'm sorry your anniversary dinner turned into this," I said, "but imagine how much worse it would have been if I had died and no one ever knew why." Then I walked out. Melissa didn't come home that night. She stayed with her parents and spent the next several days sending me angry messages. She said I had humiliated her son, that I had destroyed any chance of repairing our family. Maybe she was right. But by that point, something between us had already broken, and within a few weeks, Melissa made the decision that neither of us had been willing to say out loud until then. She filed for divorce. Melissa filed for divorce 3 weeks after the dinner at the Capitol Grill. By then, neither of us was pretending anymore. The argument that night had simply brought everything to the surface. The anger, the humiliation, the growing distance between us. It had all been building quietly since the moment the truth about Tyler's actions came out. Our lawyers handled most of the communication after that. There were no children between us, which made the legal process simpler than many divorces. The house in Highlands Ranch was sold. We divided our finances without much conflict. Melissa kept most of the furniture because, honestly, I didn't care about any of it. 5 years of marriage ended with paperwork and signatures. When the divorce was finalized, I moved into a small apartment on the other side of Denver. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Quiet in a way that felt strangely unfamiliar after everything that had happened. Physically, my recovery from the adrenal crisis went well. Within a few months, my doctors were satisfied that my cortisol levels had stabilized again. The correct medication routine was back in place, and medically speaking, my body was functioning the way it should. But the mental side of things took longer, much longer. For months afterward, I checked my medication bottle obsessively, sometimes 2 or 3 times before taking a dose. I bought a small lockbox just to store the pills, even though I now lived alone. Trust once broken that deeply doesn't repair itself quickly. Sleep became difficult too. There were nights when I woke up suddenly, my heart racing, convinced for a moment that I was back on the living room floor again, unable to move, while the room spun around me. My therapist later explained that it was a form of trauma response, something similar to PTSD. Apparently, when a person nearly dies in their own home, the brain remembers. Over time, the nightmares came less often. Life slowly settled into something quieter. The lawsuit against Daniel Grant eventually reached a settlement. His lawyers offered to cover a large portion of my medical expenses in exchange for ending the case, and after discussing it with my attorney, I agreed. I wasn't looking for revenge money anymore. I just wanted to close the chapter. As for Tyler, I had no contact with him after the divorce. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard bits of information from time to time. His college admission was gone, of course. Instead, he enrolled at the Community College of Denver and continued attending therapy sessions long after the court required it. Maybe the consequences had finally reached him. Maybe they hadn't. Either way, he was no longer part of my life. Nearly a year passed before I heard from him again. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't immediately recognize. The message was short. "Hi, Ethan. This is Tyler. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'd really like the chance to apologize in person." I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it. But something about the message felt different. After talking it through with my therapist and my brother Nathan, I eventually agreed to meet him in a public place. We chose Washington Park on a quiet afternoon. When I arrived, Tyler was already sitting on a bench near the walking path. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, less confident somehow. When he saw me, he stood up immediately. "Thank you for coming," he said. The conversation that followed lasted almost an hour. Tyler apologized, not casually, not defensively, but with the kind of raw honesty I had never seen from him before. He admitted that what he had done was cruel and reckless, that therapy had forced him to confront the reality of it, that losing college, losing friends, and living with the shame of what he'd done had changed the way he saw himself. At one point, he actually started crying. "I know I can't undo what happened," he said. "I just needed you to know I'm sorry." I listened quietly. I told him the truth, that I still struggled with what he had done, that the damage had reached further than he probably understood. But I also told him something else. That acknowledging harm is the first step toward becoming someone better. We didn't hug. We didn't suddenly rebuild a relationship. But when we stood up to leave, the weight I had carried for so long felt slightly lighter. Not gone, just lighter. Maybe forgiveness is something that arrives slowly, or maybe sometimes closure is simply the decision to stop carrying the past everywhere you go. Either way, that afternoon in the park felt like the final page of a long and painful chapter. If this story made you think about how fragile trust can be and how powerful accountability can be, consider taking a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might relate, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest lessons in life come from the people closest to us. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this: being alive isn't just about surviving what nearly destroys you. It's about deciding what kind of person you want to be afterward.